I'm all about the reveal.
Salute.
Cheers. Chin chin.
Good afternoon. How are you? I'm so thrilled to be here, Sheila.
Me too, you.
Yeah, and I'm honored. I'm really grateful for this chance. I'm grateful that you invited me here to have this conversation with you. And I've been taking this time to reflect a little bit on what a powerful mentor Sheila Pepe has been for me as an undergraduate. We met almost 25 years ago at Williams College when you were there. And I'm just thinking these past few days about how generous your spirit is, how it's still impacting me, and doubtless scores of other students who you've mentored over the years.
Well, for me, it's this idea of these relationships. You know, being a proper lesbian of a certain age, it was like, no, that's why you don't want to have children. I mean, you're going to have other children that aren't your children, or you'll have this other, kind of made family, right? So you're part of that made family, and now you get to meet the other parts of,
Well, thank you.
Geography is the only problem, but yeah.
I thought we could start with some reminiscing.
Okay.
And I thought we'd start actually with the images that just showed up before this, which were your Women Are Bricks piece. And I was interested in how you just remade this piece recently.
That's right.
In 2017. It was originally made in 1983.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it was like for your 2017 artistic self to kind of reincarnate or re-inhabit your 1983 self.
As a artist and somebody that knows about the life and former lives of works of artists, Tatline's Corner piece, for example, or things that get remade or get refound, like The Fountain, that there's this loophole of having remade work that that's been destroyed, or that you've destroyed, or that is ephemeral. And it's such an important part of my formative years as a young artist, and because it was a big material thing that I made on the way out of Mass Art, of course it got destroyed. The bricks went into the garden of the lesbian house that I lived in Allston, Mass, and didn't make it for one winter, which if you live in the North, you understand why. And the rug was given to me by my ceramics teacher, Jana Lockacre, who was getting rid of it. And I was like, I have the perfect use for that rug. And then, of course, it stopped by for this piece, and then, I was just a segue, and then it went into the dumpster. So, if one is traveling to have a life in a cheap place, these things just don't get kept. And at the time, it was just pragmatic. So I was very happy to remake it.
It seems perfect for the material, though, and for the meaning of the piece.
Yeah, I didn't understand nearly what it would mean then when I made it. There was a whole other kind of urgency about making the statement then, about this, mythic triangular essentialist group of women that are bricks in the kind of slogan way, like you're a brick, that were on these Cattell Huyuk era wheels. Like I had this whole fantasy about the goddess, whole thing. And that they would reconfigure themselves like actually had drawings that went with them at the time. They would reconfigure themselves into a wall or a stepping stone or a style or something when needed. Very adaptable piece of architecture.
Could you tell us about that time? Because you were living in Massachusetts. Could you tell us about the communities, especially the women's communities, the lesbian communities that you were a part of, and how the work, the doll project, the early work came out of that?
Well, it's a radically different time. I think the technology is one of the huge pieces that has made our lives so radically different. And visibility. And all of the social changes that have happened for lesbians and queer people, and the LGBT ad letters each year community. I came out in Boston. Like I actually went to 4 years of Catholic women's college in New Haven, with a dangerous proximity to my parents in northern Jersey, so I couldn't come out there. I didn't understand that I wasn't coming out because I didn't have language for lesbian. Literally did not know. I knew there were gay men, and then other that, there was Joe, the bus driver, who I liked. And that was it, you know. And then I moved to Boston, and suddenly there were lesbians. And I was like, wow. And then I was like, oh, I'm not one of them. And that, you know, it's like typical coming out. Like, it's almost comical. It is comical now. It wasn't comical then. So it was a lot of things. It was 80s. There's a great panel this morning about lesbians and dykes. We were radical feminists. I worked at Beatles Lunch, lesbian-owned and operated restaurant in Allston, Mass. We were angry, we danced all night, we were mean to men, except for the trans guys who would come with, you know, the really special ones that their socks are falling down, the trans women. There weren't trans men then that we knew of. But whoever wanted to be with us and was stranger than strange, like us, we were into it. It kind of didn't matter who you were. It was just incredibly like funky and exclusive. Art school was difficult. I had very empathic teachers, but there just wasn't a big presence, and I wanted to say things that there was really no cultural precedent for.
And that's kind of how I read that early work, the early doll work like Squatters' Rights,
Yeah.
but also the Doppelgangers, which are, I think, some of the most important early work in the Gothic show at the ICA as
Yeah.
kind of discovery. In my book, I tried to read it through this lens of the two. There's a wonderful book by Alenka Zupancic where she looks at the figure of noon as the moment where the sun is right above you. She looks at it through Nietzsche, where a single person becomes two. And that's kind of how I look at your doppelgangers, as this artificial noon where the object suddenly projects this shadow and becomes two, and that you only get to know yourself through alterity.
I love that. I mean, the complexity of that reading is, you know, when I read theory at Tufts at the museum school, I was like, I was really into it. I had a subscription to October magazine, the whole thing. And then at a certain point, I realized, oh, this is just describing the last 10 years of not making art and living out in Western Mass. And this incredibly rich world of sensuality and action and presence and a kind of an intellectual life that was trying to deconstruct without even the word deconstruction, trying to take apart something that was a barrier to like living and being happy in something more than your own home, to be out in the world, and even feeling safe in your own home. So, and to lodge it in a lot of art history that I had already learned. You know, it's like I love Duchamp, but Mary Daly was like, don't look at that guy stuff. And I was like, I just can't deal with it. I mean, like, I can't not love art. I am sorry that it was made by men. There's nothing I can do about it. I still love it.
At least he cross-dressed a little bit.
Yeah, he was saying, I mean, the hard guys to love were like Carl Andre, who also worked with bricks. It's like, oh man, Carl, you're killing me. But to understand that in relationship to a language one needs to use in order to communicate to a group of people who have no idea what your semi-private culture looks like. That is the way, you know, it's kind of like a broken English or something. It's because English is broken, you know, for us.
Right, and that's why we reinvent it, right? We use codes.
It's true. I mean, I love the language, but this idea of a kind of sensual, perceptive world where, I don't have language for it. I mean, where the body, like those guys you write with have the language for it. But this early work was, going back to grad school, was really about like, I'm making these dolls, I'm making this doppelganger thing. It didn't have that name yet, and I have no idea what it is or how it works, and so I need more information. It's that simple.
That's fantastic.
It's not, I mean, I think that's the only reason to get more education, is if you hit a wall, or if you are overly defensive about not having hit a wall. Then it's the sign that you might, there's some people in the government who might just know, like, education's a really good thing, And I'd say now, as then, I love the humanities as much as I love the sciences. I love art history, but I don't like it unattached. I don't like any of art unattached to context.
Absolutely. And I was even thinking when you were saying how you didn't have the language. For me, I noticed around 1999 with your show at the Mills Gallery in Boston, where you had doppelgangers mixed with lots of installations. Pretty quickly after that, in 2000, the webs start taking over. And that's what I for me, kind of indicates a shift that says, I don't need language, actually. It's affect is all we really need at a certain level, a visceral, embodied experience.
Yeah, it was that, truly. There were multiple motivations. One is that I was noticing that a lot of women who were coming out into the art world, who were doing quite well, were only referencing male precedents. And even before I read Mira Shore's essay in Wet about matrilineage, I was like, oh, there's something messed up about that. Like, what about the women who have, what about the women you're leapfrogging, basically, in order to get this work out? And so it became important to just that, and there was an overtly, there was this thing about my love of language and my love of theory and thinking, and the way there was a kind of photographic, plugging into the wall and talking about the plugging into the grand infrastructure that's not bricks and mortar. So the work was being called conceptual in a way that I thought was like a joke, because it created a binary about like what work is conceptual and what work isn't. And I think that's an interesting distinction when you use the small c, conceptual, but when you use a big C as a branding device, I was like, no, I'm not doing that anymore.
That's interesting, because you wrote this beautiful essay in the Brooklyn Rail, "The margin you feel may not be real," and you talk a lot about how exciting it is to acquire the language to talk about difference and identity, and how dangerous it can be. And I think you called it, the words were the emergent rules of inclusion, and how artists' bodies, other artists would oftentimes be forced to make work that kind of advertises that.
When I was making the doppelgangers, and I was making video at the time, that was also, I think I stopped making video because it also sort of set it up as this a kind of intellectual commodity of the art world that I don't think got seen very carefully, because it was so easily recognized as a thing, as a way to be queer. And it was more complex for me, and I usually will pull out of something that I think is too predetermined. And I happen to say no to something by leaving, basically, as that essay was talked about, following one's route to adaptation to belong and survive, and knowing when it's being done and necessary and when it's being done. And for me, I have a thing about when I'm being a spineless sap and when I'm being a critical participant, and trying to keep that very like bristling, very real for looking at the context we're working in and pushing. I met a colleague that I met recently this summer, perhaps, saying that I went to Capitoline Hill. I was in Italy, and I went to the Capitoline Museums, and I found Socrates and paid my homage, and because I think that's always what we've needed, is a kind of gadfly. And that kind of participation is just, I feel like, nowhere right now.
But then there's this other side of you that I love, and I'm thinking about this absolutely beautiful installation called Shrink from 2000, and that was curated by Nina Felshen at the Wesleyan's Gallery. And I talk about this book, and I think about it as this giant rhizome that goes in this extremely tightly structured grid, Roche Dinkeloo's building. And for me, these are really also kind of feminist interventions in this predetermined, measured space.
Yes. So the turn to that work was motivated by all these things that were kind of counter to, but it also is very much about. I was thinking a lot about it as a drawing. I am a formalist at heart, so, and feminizing or queering or lesbianizing the drawing, basically making the drawing like me, like a little tightly strung, but mostly kind of not many muscles and a lot of flesh. Like something embodied. And in that case, it actually, I had these industrial rubber bands that were right out of the box, and the whole place, this enormous space, smelled like rubber. So it was like, wow, I really am taking over this space. And that's the other.
Which could be an erotic smell as well.
Yeah, it's really, really delicious. I mean, for me, it's like, I feel I've gone back to Woolworths and I've stuck my nose in the glue and all that stuff that makes you feel like, I don't know. It just is good. It's just, I have all these, I am very work oriented. So if it's like a very special old fashioned office with all those great weird office things that I find sensual.
It's a scene. And
scene.
You're making me think about when I was like an undergraduate. You put the first paper copy of Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp in my hand. And of course, that is a liberatory moment for any baby queer who wants some new language to be able to talk about the codes that we've always been using.
Yeah.
And I think a lot about your work and the codes. Some of the codes I get, and a lot of the codes I don't. And I think that's really important too.
Yeah. I mean, some of the codes are just really tapping into, mid and late modernist sculpture. And I would want to put a little shout out for sculpture right now, because I don't think people understand how to read it anymore.
Yeah.
I think, my wife is an amazing painter, and there are times when she'll see things and go, oh, paintings. And I'll say, yeah, there was a reason why we said painting was dead at a certain point. Because it's saturated, things get saturated and people forget what rigor looks like, especially now when we've moved from a art world to an art industry. It's like, oof, not having it. I can't even imagine. Yeah.
And yet there's like this consistent attack for me on Greenbergian formalism. And I think for me, Alyssa Author writes so beautifully about how, craft-based, fiber-based work, and most of it being made by women, was of course the antithesis of the disembodied I. And I think so much about how that kind of what Caroline Jones calls as a bureaucratizing of vision for Greenberg is a way to deny the body that hurts women, hurts people of color, hurts queer people, hurts trans people, that hurts differently abled bodies the most.
I love her, and I actually reviewed that book. And here's where I differ with it. I agree with her completely, but there's at no time that we should be cutting off, like I'm happily a Greenbergian in a minute, and the next minute I have to not be. It's like, it's a drawing, but it's made out of rubber bands and, wool and shoelaces and crap. I'm not Sheila Hicks, I'm Sheila Pepe. It's like, I don't know what kind of fibers I'm using, I swear to God. I don't care. I
two
just don't.
different Sheilas, according to
Yes, I call her Big Sheila because, yeah, I can't even go there. God bless her, that's all I can say. Paris is not my favorite city. I'm more like a Naples kind of girl. Yeah, okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I can think of other. Well, you should stop there.
Great.
It's just, I'm not a fiber artist. I love all of you that have embraced me as a fiber artist. I kind of can't believe it. I really have been kind of buoyed up by younger artists who are interested in doing, and scholars doing, looking at the crafts in general, Mr. Adamson, Jenny Sorkin, the whole, everybody. But I like a mess. So going back to the Greenberg thing, we acquire all these skills as people, as citizens, as artists, and you don't throw the skills out. You accumulate them and know when to use them and why. So I think I love all of art, even the kind that I hate. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. My next question is going to be a big jump, but maybe we can tie it to some of those skills.
Yep.
Because when I was preparing for this interview, I emailed Sheila and asked pretty quickly, what's the first thing you can think of if I ask you around the 2000s, what was the single biggest episode that changed your career and your work life? And you wrote almost within 30 seconds, 9/11 changed everything. And that I didn't expect that. Of course I should have. And I wonder if you could tell us, where were you when the towers fell?
I had just gotten back from Bielefeld, Germany, having given a paper, what I thought was great and funny and kind of not completely understood paper, reporting on the state of the arts for women in New York. And I remember I showed dead cast paintings, and they were like, what? Of like Yentl, I was like, this is very New York, and it's painting, and they were like, oh, painting. And that's when I was like rooting for painting, and everybody else was like, that's commodity art. I'm like, what's not? Mm-hmm. And so I was really jet lagged, and I was asleep, and and Carrie was in Tennessee at UT, Knoxville, teaching, and I was sleeping through Brian Lehrer. If anybody's from New York, Brian Lehrer is like, he went from yada, yada, yada to yada, yada, like everybody, like the sound, and I woke up and I stood on the bottom of the tenement window and held onto the bars and looked out, and all these people were on their roofs all over the East Village, and I was like, gee, what's happening? And I looked up, and it looked like, because I was scraggy, it looked like 2 smokestacks, and I was like, whoa. And I went up to the roof because we were on the 6th floor, and there were people, then I turned on the radio and there were people upstairs, and then I came downstairs, I washed out our enormous bathtub in the kitchen and filled it with water because I thought we might need this. And that is, I have, I still have them, but they're just dead. Parents that were born in 22 and 23. And so I was like, oh, this is what they were talking about. Like, why were they always so worried all the time? Be careful, be careful, be careful. It's either because secretly they knew I was a lesbian, or, my mother, till the day she died, talked about December 7th. Pearl Harbor Day, and what she was doing, and in great minutia, like the thing, it's a trauma memory, like either you don't remember anything or you remember everything. And the world changed.
It was such a powerful one-line email to me, because I went back to your work and I started looking at everything. High Hopes from 2001.
Yeah.
New York Drawings from 2001, Under the F&G Lines, 2003, I Love New York, 2004, Bridge and Tunnel, 2004, Tunnel, 2005, Mine Ein, 2006, which have a lot of urban images in the drawings. Bus Lines, which was in New York, 2007. Red Hook at Bedford Terrace, 2008. These enormous, massive works dedicated to the city and oftentimes specifically New York.
Yeah, I mean, and the other part of that, I had just moved back, or as I like to say, it took me 20 years and a trip to Massachusetts to move across the Hudson. But I had just moved back, and my mother had died the year before. It was all this kind of coming of age stuff, coming home, settling in, being in the city that the Pepes lived in and had shops in it, really falling in love with the city again, and also realizing that it was being mauled like the way Boston had been mauled. So it was suddenly the mop and pop was kind of starting to be stripped out by like Starbucks. So I felt like I had just made it. And then this glorious blue sky day, and it just, it's a kind of trauma that you, even if you're not directly related to it, like had a loved one in it or watched it, like many of my friends have, or it's in my body. It's never going away, and it's in the whole this whole thing that I don't know how to explain completely. So that's the kind of context. It's like, when you go to the astrologer, they say, yeah, everybody's affected by Pluto. It's just one of those things.
Right?
Yeah.
I was thinking, so one of the colors that come into the work is purple,
Yeah.
a Lenten color for Catholics, and you liken it to funeral bunting.
Funeral bunting, seeing it all over the place, and also being like, wait a minute, that's my lesbian color. Why do you guys? And then it's like, oh yeah, but that's like the bishop, like, oh, where does that come from? And now when I think of it, it's like definitely a Roman color. It means that we're big
Right.
cheeses. Yeah, but it's a mourning color. Who knew? Yeah.
And one of the aspects I was thinking is actually underwritten about in your work is time, because I really started thinking about a decade of making these really monumental sized works. And we don't talk enough about how much time, and whenever I talk to you, it seems that it could be 11 o'clock texting you, you're working, and I'm thinking about the kind of endurance performance it is to make each and every one of these pieces. And I wonder if you could talk to us. I don't read a lot about your experience of time, what it's like to be making essentially a decade's worth of work of slow endurance pieces that have to come up quickly. What does your relationship of time change like in the midst of making?
Well, because it's I feel like it's a Russian doll of endurance issues, right? There's the long term, the kind of growing up with this idea that you're a good artist when you're older, like that it's not a youth culture thing, and then that work is incredibly important to my inheritance. I'm not happy unless I'm really working or watching TV or something. But, it's like work or nothing.
At the same time? Can you do them at the same time?
When I crochet, I have to now because it's a little bit like shoot me. And everybody says, get an assistant, but it's like, I don't know how I want to do it. It's just part of it.
The economics too.
The economics of it are the whole operation is incredibly economical on purpose, and the early part of the work was really about all of the work and the ephemerality of the intentional idea that you would cut something out of a space that was both physical and like very physical and ephemeral because of a decision to destroy it. Mm-hmm. But the thing that I experience most when I'm working is timelessness. In that area, now it's my therapist taught me to express it as a sense of being, that like what do they call it? Mindfulness. I was like, oh yeah, I get that when I'm in the studio. Like all the language goes away, whatever, nothing's going on, and it's like a few years later, and You know, it's actually a few hours later. But it's like you went somewhere and who knows what my fingers are. I still do that when I talk. I think my fingers are moving, I'm moving.
I love that. And I think for me, I think about that in terms of the kind of philosophical idea of intuition, and that this is an intuition a la Henri Bergson, where it's time-based, not intuition just in I'm kind of improvising, and that's a different kind of work, but I'm thinking intuition where when you fall into this Zen moment and time doesn't work in that syncopated, measured way, you connect to everything behind you and even to all the virtual possibilities ahead of you. And I think that's, for me, one of the beauties of why crocheting does this, because these loops are actually connected to everything behind, and then the loops talk about what could emerge in any moment.
Yeah, and the loops are not orderly. They don't have to be orderly. They don't have to be in rows. They don't have to be on any kind of, like I have this little Cartesian part of my brain that's battling with the Wittgensteinian part of my brain, and then they have this little dance, and it's a little bit of chaos. In the beginning, there were more decisions about, well, I'll go down like this, and then I'll come over like this, and now it's motor memory, which makes it be like that. In the beginning, it was a kind of jazz experience, or it's like somewhere between American jazz, salsa, and klezmer music, like that kind of like, it's all like that, a New York experience.
That's great. What do you think the experience is for your viewers? I think a lot about your work as a viewer, and I think we experience another version of that, not the duration, but I do feel like we collapse separations, and they really connect us through the shadows, through the lines.
So now it's like an overused term, but I used to teach this class way back at RISD called Making Multivalence, which actually it was all the prompts were science, because I found multivalence in chemistry class, and I was like, oh yeah, it's like shared paired electrons and all that kind of stuff. Where are you going to attach?
Right.
Where's the audience going to attach? And who's going to get flown off into another orbital? If this makes any sense to anybody, that's good. But it's, I went to this panel the other day, medieval work, and the beauty of it is that, and meeting in Italy, is that everything's attached literally to everything else physically. So the sculpture is attached to the architecture, the painting's attached to the architecture. It's like Italians didn't invent they didn't invent canvas painting. It's like they didn't really have a need for it. They just scrub something out and paint over it. But everything was always attached to the Etruscans. And that idea that you would have multiple entry points and have one thing physically and literally lead to the other is extremely important. So in the beginning, I had a couple of tests, like if it could be read like a Judy Pfaff drawing in space, like click, 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 click. And then if kids liked it, very good. If crocheters were like, I crochet too, I'd be like, oh, I love you. And then I would get the occasional guard who would, one guard was remarkable. I did this whole thing in men's boot and shoelaces, and he was like, it's like a whole battalion of men just marched in here. And I was like, okay, brother, you got it. So it's a projection field. It's a place for the thing that most people are afraid to do when they go into a museum, which is project or interpret or take a chance on something. And I like this idea of accumulating those interpretations. Like, I don't care to control the meaning of it. I think I'm setting up the work so that it has multiple meanings. And then I just take the indication of another invitation by a curator that they understand that it's something else too. Mm-hmm. Or a conversation with you. It's a radically different thing. We can talk about something else without them, and then there's this other thing that's going to happen with this audience.
Absolutely. So you had mentioned to me that your 60th birthday has really impacted you, and you started thinking a lot about death.
Yeah.
And maybe culture that surrounds death.
Yeah.
What does this look like in your life?
A lot of Pema Chodron. It's actually a lot of it's a lot of history. So a number of you who I know this for the past, now it seems like forever, 5 years, I don't know, 7 years. I don't really read anything about art. I only read history, and I listen. So I'm listening to lectures, to books, to novels sometimes, but mostly, and watching tons of documentaries. And so big world histories, like I'm very interested in the whole long history of Central Asia. It blows my mind how important that was to both the Far East and the Far West as a connective tissue, and different philosophies, different religions. The more history, the more religion I study, the bigger of an atheist I become. It's really fabulous. And the more I appreciate all of these things being various systems to get at what we now call government, science, knowing, and art and interpretation. So, like, for example, the first art we mostly know about was put in a pit with dead people. And the dead people at Lake Catalhoyuk, they're like buried, generations are buried like underneath where you sleep. That's crazy. Like, to live in a place in a time, which is most of human history, where death is always present and talked about. I mean, I grew up in a family like that. Somebody was always dying, and we were always going to a wake.
That's
what
very
happens.
Italian-American, right?
I know, like, so-and-so, Z, died. You want to go to the wake? Sheila's too young for the wake. I'm like, I want to go. You know, like, I didn't know this person. No, I'll say him. But just and then the fear of the wake, the fear of seeing your parents crying, or just this tremendous amount of emotion, and just this constant idea that you get old and then you die. And then all of the culture that comes with it, like the Catholicism that I'm really invested in now, or reinvesting, is the Catholicism of a long history that is really, as I like to say, Roman Catholic, not any other kind of Catholic, because there are several kinds, but it's because it's Roman. Right. It's filled with little tchotchkes in the wall.
There's paganism and syncretism.
Oh, everything. You know, there's, bull's blood and the whole 9 yards.
So is there a religious search going along?
No, actually, it's just the opposite. It's like, oh, that's a really nice parable, and art is and was always the non-governmental route to making meaning. You know, it's like the pre-CAA version of making art, if you know what I mean. Like, art without any kind of organizing, except for this particular unit wants to put this guy's sword and her horse with her when they go.
So if you're looking outside of CAA, looking at anthropology, religion, world history, is there a frustration you have with the world, the art machinery today?
Yeah, it's become too professionalized. It's too much about how to get an opportunity and not enough about how this fits as an opportunity in and of itself.
And how do we change that?
I think the kind of jobs I've had, the way I've survived with bits and pieces of jobs and cobbling things together exclusively in the art world, I think should be over. I'm sorry, guys. I know this is not CAA's mission, but I think it should be. I think of painters who were doctors, or were craftspeople who also, or you make a craft beer, that's great. That we reimagine what it is to make stuff. And I don't know. I'm so deep down my own rabbit hole trying to keep everything going. I just know that I have a hard time teaching now because there's nothing slow about the wacky kind of conversation I want to have in the studio.
Yeah.
And I do still, but it's not what most students are craving.
It does make me think a lot about how much of your work from the very beginning has been collaborative, and that might be another model of work. I'm thinking about recent work when you did Common Sense in multiple places, but also the Republic of Georgia, where people started making the work, they unraveled the work, they remade the work. I'm thinking about your research station for the people in Shenzhen.
Yeah. It crops up. There's a time and a place where there is a collaboration like this collaboration with Carrie. It's very meaningful. It's very much fun. It's really a speculative play. It's like, it's kind of, I like making stuff that will have a difficult identity in the market. It's a little, not a very good feminist routine in terms of, having something that stays and lives on for posterity. But in the moment, it feels like a little bit of, inspired by Socrates, like a little bit of push and pull play, instigating a problem, creating a problem that's not something to be solved necessarily, but something to be considered.
Would you talk more about the work that you've been doing with Carrie Moyer, the painter, your wife? And especially, I'm thinking about you've been in multiple residencies, Radcliffe's, Bunting Institute, Siena, but I think it was Civitella in Italy where you started working
this
together?
past fall. So in the mid-2000s, I think, we went to Yaddo as collaborators, which I have to confess, Yaddo. We really wanted to go to Yaddo together in the summer. And I said, come on, let's apply. Let's just apply as collaborators. We'll do little projects. We won't put too much pressure on it because that could be disastrous. And we worked on our own stuff and did these very kind of scripted call and response things. I would make the structure, she would paint on it. They were physical constraints, and it was good. We made a few paintings. We made a magic writing glove for Alice Randall. It was fun. Then a few years later, we did the same thing as Joan Mitchell, and we applied with our own work and the work from Yaddo. And there, we just made collaborative stuff, and it was a blast. We had a beautiful studio. We were in the same studio. We had like a little furniture divider between us to keep everything safe. Like, you stay over there, I'll stay over here. Okay, that's fine. I know you need your private space, Carrie. Or we would take turns. I'd do the laundry, she'd be in the... And then the wall came down, we were in there together, we were passing stuff, we were just working. I was like, can I paint on that? She was like, sure. She's like, but here, basically we found out a lot about how we influence each other and how we work. And then the Civitella thing came up and we were going, and then we got an invitation to have the show in Portland. And Jamie DeSimone, the curator, didn't know that we made collaborative work. And didn't know, she just wanted to have a two-woman show. And so we came back with a proposal that included all this collaborative work. There's not a lot, but some key pieces. And this big center area of the Portland Museum, which if you've been there, it's this enormous volume that never seemed to be used completely. Of course, I want to just fill it. And so we made a piece together called Parlor for the People, which is a lot like the Shenzhen place, but it's definitely, the color is okayed by me, but designed by Carrie. How about this color? No. How about this? Yeah, I like that. So, and then I made chairs, which are kind of Roman-inspired camp chairs, and rugs and pillows, and I mean, we had a lot of fun. We've done a lot of things we've wanted to do. See, that's the thing. It's like, is this part of our work now? Well, I guess so. Where does it fit in your oeuvre? It's like, I don't know. I don't care.
These are from one of your collaborative works, Opera Buffa.
Yeah, this is a panel. We made this huge. So at Civitella, we were in Italy for maybe 2 weeks before, just soaking it all up, and me being like, oh oh my God. I was in Naples for the first time, which is where my people are from. We were just soaking up all of this information, and we created this kind of semi-altarpiece, this crazy work on paper. I don't even really know how to describe it yet. We haven't.
I love it, and I think about the recitative back and forth. But I was wondering if we could talk, maybe we're going towards the end, on one of your newest works, which will show up pretty soon. It's
which is part of the show.
Yeah.
American Bardo.
And
Let's say it together, John.
Yeah.
American
Jinx.
Bardo.
So I'm thinking about that work because it'll show up pretty soon, I promise. It's an upholstered Catholic kneeler. Bardo refers to the Tibetan Buddhist state between death and rebirth. And
49 days.
Wow. If it could only be, how long is November from now?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about how everyone from center left in America is waiting for Bardo. We're waiting for the rebirth, right?
Well, I think everybody's in the state, whether they embrace it or not. I mean, I think people center-right are thinking we will invoke their Bardo if we win. You know, there's a big question in the world about why everything's so balkanized and why people are so fearful and why we hate each other so much. Yeah. And we're afraid of each other so much.
Yeah.
So, you know, Bardo is just this crazy, those Eastern religions, man, they really know how to do it without having God. This idea that in this portion of time, you have a chance at, you know, getting the brass ring. You could go all the way to nirvana, or not so much, depending on how you use that time. And I think that's like daily life. If we just use that as a way of looking at, you know, how you get up in the morning, like what's the priority set today? But
I'll end on an optimistic question for you to kind of help us get up tomorrow, right, for the next. I was reading in last June for LGBTQ plus Pride, Hyperallergic interviewed some young emerging artists, and one of them was Alonso Pantoja, and they asked him, what are the three greatest influences on your work? And he replied, Sheila, Pepe, journaling about daily experiences, and Beyonce. And I loved thinking about you and getting you and Beyonce on the same stage. But I was wondering if you could just end maybe telling us a little bit about how you feel knowing that you are empowering millennials and the I generation, especially queer, underrepresented artists, to build a practice.
Well, I think that's like a dream come true. You know, that's the teacher part. It's like you walk around and you're a teacher, hopefully. If you do, you know, that's the Jesus part. I hate to say it, but you know, my father was, right before my father died, I said, Dad, if you had one other thing you could do before, you know, instead of owning a deli, what would you have done? He wanted to be a teacher. And I was like, wow, well, he's like a great teacher by example. You know, and it's not the God part, but it's this idea that there are philosophies around the world where the idea is that you teach by example. And that's not easy, that's not directive information, that's not objective. Here are your 5 objectives information. That's wanting to be wise and wanting to what I was taught to me as a young person, being a good artist was that. And being able to integrate all of this knowledge and for it to be not just about me or you or some subjective experience, but a collective experience, culture.
That's wonderful. Could we use that to open it up to questions?
I love questions.
Great. So, hi. You mentioned earlier half of your brain being Wittgenstein. So I'd love to hear what compels you about Wittgenstein.
It's the, you know, I'm very narrowly focused on one thing that has kind of allowed me to both feel normal for my own time, somewhat normal, and also understand how I work and how how ideas work for me, and that is family resemblances. So this way of organizing language, he's talking about language, but I think we could say we're talking about forms or the language of art, where it's not Cartesian, it's not a fixed point of numerical, there's no grid involved, there are no lists, there are no boundaried categories, there are sets of family relationships where there are shared likenesses. It's kind of, in my mind now, it's what people would call a mind map, perhaps, or Venn diagrams, or, you know, A union B intersect. So there are these more likenesses, like he describes games that are field games and, you know, games that they have all different kinds of games. Ping pong is a game, and so is cards. And how does the relationship between all of these, why do we call them all games? Because there's nothing, one thing that's common to them all. I mean, now that seems relatively normal to people who passed from the analog life to the digital life, because we can see how we search for things differently. But I believe that if you only grew up in the digital life, you ran past Wittgenstein's family resemblances, and you now live in a purely categorical world again, because the code is invisible to us. Is this making any sense to anybody? Yeah. So I think now it's like, I was talking to somebody, Lexi, before, it's like, the dialectic is back. That's amazing. The dialectic is from my younger years. That's what the nuns taught us. Dialectic, dialectic, dialectic. And that's good, but it's not, can't replace everything else. It's and, or, but and mostly. More inclusion, bigger tent.
I'll ask you a really practical question.
Please.
On behalf of the students who might be in the room. I'm wondering, because you have some criticisms of current art education. Mm-hmm. I wonder, how about advice, especially for people who are young and emerging in their career? What other kinds of learning experiences should they incorporate for their studio practice?
I have very precise, I've gone from the mushy to the precise. I think everyone should get a full history, a humanities degree first, a liberal arts degree first, that people should learn to write first, read first, take a lot of history that's incorporated with art history. History, if you're an American and you don't know the history of this country, not just one history, but the many histories that have been, let's just say, left out, strategically left out for most of my lifetime, you're a mess. You can't even be a citizen, let alone an artist. And those two things are linked, I think. And so, yes, and you also have to work on a lot of things that are about artistic skills, but I actually think most of all you have to work at it because you love it, and then if you work at it because you love it, close your ears, you don't need credit for that. You just need to do it. And if you don't approach art that way, leave. I'm sorry, but leave. There are too many people who need to say something, that are dying to say something, that we have not heard from, who are working very hard to do that. If you don't have a need to say something, to communicate, not just to express yourself, you're in the wrong business. It's not your Instagram feed. Sorry, I'm like, man, and another thing. Yeah, well, I'm on it all the time, but, But I'm just saying, it's like the urgency of why this is, I think even among some of the younger artists for whom it is critical politically critical, and they are being hijacked by a system that needs them too badly to represent for them, for the institution, not for themselves, not for a community of people who need to have a slow conversation about what is going on in our world. So you have to allow young artists to take time, and it's just way too much work. It's 7 days a week, 20 hours a day, forever, with, you know, a few years for a breakdown here and there. And that's what it is. And if you're not up for that, pick something else. Or pick a part of the art world that's more about entertainment than about meaning making, which I think we're being given that choice right now. Yeah.
Tammy has a question.
Too. So, as someone who has such a strong art practice, and you have consistently also taught for so long, and if we could go through maybe teaching as being maybe peaks and valleys over a career, maybe after, I don't know. How have you found a way over a longer career in both of those areas to have them support each other, or to have questions that push you back into the studio to get you re-engaged, or like that energy? Like, can you talk about that energy that goes back and forth?
So when I first started teaching and making art, they was both happening at the same time. I was like talking as much in grad school as I was making stuff. I went to the museum school, that's what we did. You know, it was like lots of talking, lots of making. They're probably less making. But Mass Art was the worker school, so I had the hybrid. Also, I grew up in a working family, so everybody worked. So marrying the work ethic along with it, that was important. And I could see that those two things at the time had to go together to survive, to make the kind of work I made and to be the kind of teacher I wanted to be. And I've been deep in academia, in part of the administration and doing different things. And I'm like a professional renegade. Like, I've never had a full-time teaching job. I've only had a full-time administrative job where I feel like I was a part of a change, big change, and set up a change that then happened. But then I left. That was the end of the job. I didn't know that people don't keep change agents around. So it's, I'm married now, technically, but I have a partner for 20 years who wants to do exactly what I do, which is be in the studio all the time, except for when we're teaching, and then go home and sleep and eat, get a lot of takeout. Like, we have no children, we have no responsibilities other than that. Whatever, that's what we do. That's what we wanted to do. That was the miracle of finding each other. That's rare. So a lot of my advice is probably not even pertinent anymore, because, and this is why I don't teach as much, the world has changed, the art world, whatever this is, has changed so radically. And I would argue, like Andrew Yang would argue, it's the technology that's changed everything, that's made us so hateful and unfortunate. It's and people's uncertainty about the future, not having a job, not feeling vital, or living in small. So I'm meandering again. I'm trying to channel Calvino. I mean, the advice, the advice is priorities, stamina, and really being willing to say, I do not know what the hell you're talking about. Somebody explain this to me. Like, always educating yourself, always being the student. If you don't have time to allow yourself to be the student while you're working in your own work, then it's a total drag. Never be the professional. Just do professional things when they're required. Don't worry about being a professional. Just worry about doing a good job.
Thank you for that question. I know that we're
out.
We're at the time, but I wanted to ask.
Down there, so I want everybody to give a
Hey.
big